Hello to everyone, good afternoon. It's Jeff, I'm Santiago, and I will be hosting today's commercial awareness deep dives. Um, my colleagues would like to present themselves. First, Gia,
Hello.
as well as we would like to welcome as well Nick Padden and Zach Pucky.
Hi guys, nice to meet you.
Amazing. And so for today, if you want to move on to the next slide, we will be learning about firstly airlines, the cannabis debate, secondly, and corporate governance reform and implications, and the Suez Canal. Let's proceed to the next slide. Airlines. What's the current situation of airlines, we may ask? Firstly, as a background, airlines has been hit the most in 2020. Furthermore, they still have around 20 billion in debt. And that's the thing about it, where even British Airways owner IAG has offered some of its lucrative crown jewel slots in Heathrow Airport. Furthermore, there's going to be sort of equity stakes, buying equity stakes from for UK government for them to be able to survive. So what will be its role in revitalizing the economy, may I ask? Firstly, in being able for the airlines to keep on running, the idea is that the jobs that will be able to continue. Because for the moment being, for your information, one of the airlines, British Airways, has simulators in its Heathrow base at hour 15 to be able to make sure that it's 24/7 running for pilots to have work the minimum hours that they need to maintain licenses. Furthermore, it will save many furloughed jobs, firstly in regards to the airplanes, pilots, cabin crews, flight attendants, as well as airports. Gatwick Airport, Heathrow Airport, it's empty. That's why they need staff in security, in helping the luggages, and being able to help with the ones who, what's the word for it, to check in and check out all the passengers. Furthermore, secondly, the tourism industry is going to, the airline industry has a really vital effect on the tourism industry. Firstly, all those bars that have been struggling with just takeaways, restaurants, and as well as tourist spots, those packaging deals, and like for example with the, as you have known about Thomas Cook, and with regards to other airlines that have been affected because they don't have the deep pockets to be able to survive in, even in the winter, how much more in for 1 year almost, right? So I think that's the second sort of role of the UK, of the airlines, to be able to facilitate the UK economy. The third role, it's cargo and shipment. As you can see, at which it will be the fourth topic that we'll discuss, the Suez Canal. If the Suez Canal just gets blocked, well, I mean, that's billions of pounds of goods is going to be delayed because of that. With airlines, you don't have that issue where you can you can send many goods in the air, since there's not really that much blockade on it. Furthermore, with exports, UK exporters will have a great benefit of their business. Secondly, UK imports, there's going to be more goods coming here, and as well as the UK's plan to make sure that Heathrow, especially with their with the Heathrow's plan on their third runway, right, to make sure that it still becomes a global hub for travel, for exporting goods and importing goods, but especially for it to maintain its global power, even despite Brexit. So what are the barriers for airlines to operate? Firstly, the lockdown. There is a lot of uncertainty because of COVID-19, especially with the vaccinations coming through, with the UK with having a lot of progress regarding it. It's still a pending issue whether or not on June we'll be lifting that lockdown or not. That's why I think the issue regarding airlines being able to operate is that what what it could bring as well, for, because bringing people is a massive risk for such a contagious virus such as COVID-19. So that's why that's the first barrier to operate. Secondly, it's that despite many pilots being trained in simulators, right, they haven't had a training in regards to having that sort of schedules and sleeping patterns, being able to train the pilots in a real life situation, I suppose. Hopefully, the simulators might reflect it. Don't get me wrong, but indeed that's a big question as well. And thirdly, but regarding Boeing 747, I think the models, there's still a lot of uncertainty regarding how it would, sort of work now, since the airplanes have not really, not most of them, probably a few flights or so, but most of the airlines have kept their planes in maintenance, but they haven't really flown as much. So that's a sort of topic regarding airlines. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Jeff. I mean, what do you think what do you think the role of the legal industry has been in terms of the airlines? Like, how does this relate?
Definitely, I think airlines, companies such as, so law firms such as Clyde and Co, Northern Fulbright, as well as DLA Piper, tier one in the legal 500 in aviation. Furthermore, as well as many airlines. As well, I'll give you an example. Like the landing slots, if someone wants to purchase it, that's lawyers that have to do the filing as well, being able to make sure that they go, like real estate lawyers, make sure that they go to the owners, the ones who will buy it. Furthermore, with if they want to merge with another company, with a rival, they need lawyers for it. And so if you think about it, tax is always important, and that's why it's always key for each single company for it to run. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. I think there's a couple of other areas that's kind of relevant to law as well. So I think kind of financing of plane, leasing, refinancing, that sort of thing. That's all the sort of stuff, the kind of bread and butter of aviation lawyers. And so I think that's going to be kind of interesting to see kind of how that's going to progress in the next couple of months coming out of COVID. I think one trend that's kind of potentially identifiable coming out of COVID is kind of the consolidation of airline companies. So instead of having, say, 6 or 7 providers within a country, instead we might be seeing more like 3 or 4. And we've already seen a huge wave of kind of merger activity in the aviation sector. And so I think that's kind of another trend to watch out for in this sort of climate.
Yeah, I think building on that, if I just touch on the whole kind of merger point you just made there, Nick, I think if you look at in terms of what are the barriers for airlines to operate, deregulation is always one that can provide better barriers, better conditions for someone to operate into. So with aviation in particular, in 1978, you did have the deregulations there, and up to 2006, there were 40 airline mergers that were conducted within that period. So you can see the effect that such a move could take. So there's an argument, or definitely a line of thinking that suggests, is this an area where we need to look at the regulation to kind of improve the prosperity of the industry? So I think that'd be a good area to look at.
Yeah, that's really great. I mean, thanks Jeff for that. Next, we're going to be talking about the cannabis debate. Essentially, there's a debate at the moment about whether cannabis should be legalized in the UK. So the current situation is that CBD, which is one component of cannabis, is completely legal in the UK and has been since 1978. But you can't make the CBD oil from cannabis leaves in the UK at the moment. And to be honest, even the leaves itself, they're not illegal. It's the percentage of something called THC in cannabis leaves that are illegal. They're what causes hallucinations and changes the brain function. Now, obviously, in the past couple of years, cannabis has been legalized in quite a few states in the US, in Canada as well. And we've also found quite a few medical uses for cannabis. And this has kind of changed the game on how the government considers whether it should be legal or illegal. And since 2018, medical marijuana has been legal. And if you go into Holland and Barrett at the moment, or like any other drugstore, you're going to find CBD oils, which come from cannabis. So there has been like a recent debate about whether 2021 is going to be the year that the UK legalizes it. And to be honest, it will have quite a few positive impacts. First of all, it can be taxed really heavily, just like cigarettes, which means that we can kind of find some way of bouncing back from the inevitable recession after the pandemic. Also, we can be using empty retail spaces for these shops, and hopefully that would encourage more people to come into the high street, and crowds breed crowds. So it might encourage people who are maybe nervous about going back into the high street after the pandemic to go back out again. And also in terms of employment, people are going to need to man these shops. So hopefully it can do something to mitigate against unemployment rates. There are issues though. I mean, one of which is that there is a big stigma with cannabis. It is seen as a recreational drug, and it has been, and it can be used for that, as well as its medicinal uses. And people kind of have some sort of stigma against that, especially it's like with cigarette smoking, anything else, like it might take a while for it to become mainstream. But one of the other things that's really kind of interesting about potentially legalizing cannabis is the fact that it would then have to be there would have to be regulations, which at the moment we don't have. And currently that puts a lot of people at risk. So it's 0.2% of THC, which is that hallucinogenic, mind-altering substance in cannabis, is kind of where it then becomes, it goes from being sort of medicinal to a recreational drug and can be quite dangerous. So people who are being sold these drugs at the moment, they don't know what percentage of anything is inside these leaves. They're just buying it because they're obviously buying it on the black market. They're not buying it through legal means. And having greater regulation could potentially protect people's health as well. And it might mean that we have less stress on the NHS as well. Particularly as cannabis is one of what's called a gateway drug. So drug dealers try and sell cannabis, and then once someone's hooked on that, they try and get them to take slightly stronger, class A drugs, which have a lot worse effects. So yeah, that's sort of the situation at the moment. What do you guys think about that?
I think it's a really interesting area in terms of the whole debate, because I think, like you're saying, the point of stigma, there's always this kind of conversation that is it just going to be used for recreational purposes, and people don't see the good effects that it can have. But if you're looking at, say, the New York, what do you think there? In terms of the tax revenue stuff that you were talking about there, they could potentially gain 4.2 billion in tax revenues next year, or when they plan to do it. And they're looking to use that in minority communities to help them there. So if people can get themselves away from, oh, it's just for recreational use and the whole stigma of that, and actually look at the benefits it can bring, then there's definitely a better conversation that can happen on that front in terms of where this can go and the progress it can bring.
I think the key point here is regarding, like a new sector, a new industry, which will bring a lot of jobs. I think that's the sort of key where, especially with the UK economy, as you said before, that will possibly encourage, a lot of people to go to the high street. But not even that, even online, e-commerce, it's sort of a new sort of, let's say, startup, because it's really big in, let's say America and the US, with many states allowing it in a ways, and even in Canada as well. So it will bring possibly more benefits than negatives.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think also, just touching on the stigma point again, it's kind of like there's an interesting debate within that in itself, whether or not it should be fully legalized or if it should be decriminalized. For example, in Portugal, yeah, all drugs are decriminalized, so from anything from weed to heroin or anything essentially. And so whether or not decriminalization would be better to kind of match the kind of stigma against marijuana use and that sort of thing. So there's still a civil penalty for taking it, but essentially you can still get the tax benefits. I think that's certainly another kind of avenue to kind of look down. But I think in kind of broader terms, the kind of relaxation or regulation of cannabis and kind of legalizing it would kind of mean it would be seen as kind of a viable investment. And so currently the only way you can really invest in kind of cannabis producers is directly in companies, which kind of has its own risks just in that, and also in kind of cannabis exchange traded funds. But you can't actually invest in those from the UK at the moment. And so by legalizing that kind of creates a whole new asset class essentially, or kind of whole new area of investment. And we've already seen a lot of kind of institutional investments, a number of hedge funds becoming interested in the kind of growth of cannabis as an kind of institutional investment vehicle. So I think it could also have kind of huge benefits for the kind of investment scene as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting on the point about decriminalisation. I saw that there was a festival where they didn't get anyone who bought drugs in once they were in the festival. They didn't get into trouble for it, and instead they had these safe places where they could take the drugs. And that year they had like the fewest number of drug-related deaths and hospitalizations. So I definitely think that's an interesting way forwards.
I think just building on the point that Nick made on the investments, the investment element of it, I think if you look at, obviously with this comes a lot of regulation, and that can cause a lot of fluctuations within stock price. If I use an example, Aurora Cannabis is a Canadian producer of cannabis, more for medicinal purposes, but has the potential to also look into the recreational elements of it. But if you look at their 52-week range, their stock price, you know, it ranged from $4.93 to $26.79. There's huge fluctuation in that. So in terms of, you might see some kind of retail investors view it as an arbitrage opportunity where, you know, you can get in, get out, make your gains, but it's certainly not a stable investment at the minute until regulation is a bit clearer or people know where the future is going, because there is a lot of uncertainty that comes with this debate at the minute, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's quite interesting your point about recreational versus medicinal use of the drug. And I think depending on whether and what is allowed when it does or if it becomes legalized, I think that is going to change massively how it is viewed as well. I don't know if anyone has thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it'll take possibly a couple more years after it becomes legalized, if it becomes legalized, to kind of change the kind of culture around it and the kind of perception of it. But I think that's something that will change over time as people become kind of more used to it. But just kind of, I guess, tying it back to like the commercial side of things. Essentially, I think another kind of interesting point is kind of going to be if it's legalized in the UK, kind of how companies are going to expand from the US over here. I think a number of them, for example, Aurora Cannabis from Canada, have already got business plans for kind of predicting legalization in the next 5 to 10 years in the UK, as well as other major European countries. They've already got business plans for growth here. So again, it's kind of a really interesting area in that sense as well, as kind of as businesses kind of grow in that sort of area, how they're going to expand into different territories and how that's kind of going to affect their stock price, etc.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things as well is how it's going to be used in medicine in the UK. Is it going to be allowed for people to prescribe it medicinally? I mean, it is at the moment, but you have to be part of a specific group of doctors. So it might be more widely used. And then will it be more expensive if it's legalized or less expensive? Because currently we're getting the oil already extracted. And obviously, because of the manufacturing processes, you would assume that it would be more expensive when you're getting the oil and not the leaf. But potentially, if people are going to bring business over here, they're going to want to basically ring it for all the money they can get from it. So that will be interesting too, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, which side of the debate do you guys fall on? Are you kind of pro legalization, pro decriminalisation, or just kind of keep it banned?
I mean, personally, for me, I think legalizing it is possibly the best way to go, just because it's been proven that, you know, it's recreational use. It's not as it doesn't affect people as much as the potential medicinal uses of it. I mean, it covers so many different diseases and afflictions. So you can use it for arthritis, you can use it for autism, for epilepsy. Like, there are so many things you can use it for. So I think it's definitely, I definitely stand with side of legalizing it. I don't know what the rest of you think.
I think I'm just, don't really have specific, sort of opinion about it. I think it's, if it works for the economy and there's personal demand here, it should be fine.
I think it's an interesting one because I'm not sure the statistics on the kind of death rates that come from recreational use of cannabis, but suddenly if you compared that to that of alcohol, there'd definitely be an interesting discussion to have there, because as much as alcohol is a legalized, it's just a very legalized thing. You can obviously have your drinks at the pub or whatever with your friends, obviously when COVID allows it, but as in, it's one of those ones you definitely have a really interesting discussion where you go, well, actually, if we look at the death rates from alcohol per year, which I don't know the exact statistics, but they are higher than a lot of people think. Certainly comparing that to that of cannabis would be very interesting to kind of go from that line of view and thinking, okay, is it therefore okay to legalize from that stance?
Yeah, definitely. Well, that was quite an interesting one. So let's move on next.
Right, so I'm going to be talking about corporate governance reform and its implications. Just a bit of warning, this is a disgracefully dry topic, but it's one that's kind of really, really important. It's going to have huge kind of ramifications. And so I thought I'd try and cover it to give you a bit of a summary of kind of what's going on, why it's important, etc. So I'm going to go through like why reform's needed, what those reforms are going to look like, and the implications of them. So firstly, why is reform needed? There's kind of two reasons for this. Firstly, it kind of follows a series of high-profile corporate collapses. So you're looking at kind of companies like Carillion, as well as Wirecard most recently. And these corporate collapses have been kind of caused in part by negligent auditing reports by kind of the big four companies like KPMG, Deloitte, EY, and PwC. And if those audits have been done kind of better, it might have meant there might be some kind of given a bit more time for creditors to prepare for the insolvency that was kind of looking to be inevitable, which should have been picked up. And I think the second reason that reform is needed is that there's kind of ongoing concerns, particularly in the UK, about about a lack of competition and resilience in the audit market. As I said, it's kind of auditing and corporate governance kind of dominated by four firms: PwC, Deloitte, EY, and KPMG. And I think there's kind of interesting kind of discussion around antitrust law and competition law there, and something I'll kind of touch on a bit later. And so I think the next kind of thing to establish is who would be affected by these reforms. So it's obvious that the big four are going to be affected in quite a large way. And I think kind of seeing their business, their kind of plan for the next couple of years in light of these proposed reforms is something that's going to be really, really interesting. But I think other than those firms, kind of aside from the auditing side of the reforms, other firms that are going to be targeted are kind of public interest entities. And these essentially mean kind of publicly floated companies, banks, insurance firms, and it'll probably extend to alternative investment market stocks, as well as private companies. So it's really, really kind of broad sweeping, and essentially any company that has kind of is kind of operates in a number of different cities or has kind of a large employee kind of pool is going to be targeted by this. So it's really going to affect a lot of companies in the UK. And so I'll quickly just take you through the kind of the reforms that are being proposed, and then I'll go through the implications. So the first one is kind of an audit regulator is being introduced, and this replaces the Financial Reporting Council, which is essentially the previous regulator. And essentially this is called ARGA, the Audit Reporting and Governance Authority. It's going to have kind of broader powers and also kind of expanded powers, and they can actually action an operational split of audit firms. And so that is essentially is kind of the biggest deal for KPMG Deloitte, because it could essentially mean they'll be broken up by the regulator, which is kind of a really, really big move from a regulator. Although I think this kind of reform is a little bit limited in scope, because we're essentially replacing an old regulator with the new regulator, with no promise of that kind of actually substantially changing anything. So I'm not too sure on kind of the reasons for that, because a kind of cultural shift is needed in the industry. Another reform that's been proposed is dividends and capital maintenance. Essentially, directors will have to state prior to making a dividend payment that the making of that payment will not cause the company to become insolvent. And this is a really, really good reform. It means that when a company is collapsing or something like that, the directors won't be able to pay themselves huge dividends. And instead, that money will be reserved for the creditors and for the kind of consumers involved in the company, as well as the employees. So I think that's a really, really positive reform. There's also kind of slightly kind of more dull reforms as well, such as kind of reporting and internal controls, making like an annual resilience statement, essentially kind of setting out the company's prospects and challenges of using its current business model, and then kind of comparing that to the short, medium, and long-term kind of growth of the company. And I think a final reform that's quite interesting as well is there's going to be further sanctions for director wrongdoing. Essentially, directors owe duties to the company they work for. They can't. They have to promote the success of the company, and they can't kind of actively compete with the company. So they can't go to competitors and offer their work, etc. And so there's going to be even more kind of sanctions for kind of negligent statements of or negligent financial reporting among directors. And it's likely that clawback provisions will be included in all director contracts in the UK, which is another really, really big reform, which essentially means that if, for example, the actions of the director impacts the reputation of the company or the financials of the company, it essentially means that the company can take back a proportion of their pay. And so directors are really being hit hard here. And I think it's going to be interesting for kind of law firms providing advice on these sort of issues. And so kind of the wider implications. So as I've said a couple of times, the big four accounting firms are going to be kind of the worst off. There's a chance they'll be broken up. They'll certainly be reduced in kind of size, and they'll be subject to a lot more scrutiny. So I think the development of those firms are going to mean that a lot of smaller accountancy firms are going to start kind of competing with the big four. And so kind of it's going to hopefully lead to kind of more healthy competition within the market. I think that's really, really important. And then kind of broader than just the accounting firms, it seems like these reforms are going to impact almost every director in the UK of kind of a decently sized company. And so with more kind of liabilities imposed on the directors, as well as kind of sanctions they could be subject to, as well as a whole host of new duties that they have to kind of abide by. It's going to be interesting to see how kind of directors adapt, and kind of how companies shift their kind of business plans around these kind of new regulations. So that's kind of my introduction to the corporate governance reforms that have been proposed. What do you guys think? Do you guys like the reforms? What sort of impacts do you expect to see in the next couple of years?
Yeah, for me, I think the key part here is that I agree that there should be reforms in regards to the audit sector, but I think the proposals that I see is quite limited. For example, audit regulator. although the Financial Reporting Council was inefficient in the sense that it did handle a lot more scope than just the audits. Having this audit regulator would mean that it's more specialists in regulating the audits, like audit companies. However, with regards to regulators, let's say that if they don't have that much powers, let's say, to be able to limit the financial scope of the financial sort of the audit company, it wouldn't be that much of an effect if it's, let's say, if the fines, it's just, let's say, like 15K, 20K, they wouldn't really care to violate the sanctions or violate the rules imposed by the audit regulator. Furthermore, regulators, they tend to be subject into the audit or the companies that they regulate. They tend to let's say sweeten the deal, or like they tend to, like, other companies do, let's say, entice them to like package like deals, or like even give them gifts to make sure they have a good relationship and they get more of an advantageous position in that sense. That's a possibility. And thirdly, it's just that the audit regulators, we're not sure how much experience do they have in handling big corporations such as the Big Four. So I think that's a sort of key and how it will be limited. The second proposal, I think it's really key, and I think it will be more beneficial because in limiting the financial, like of the audit company, they will definitely deter them from doing wrongdoing. Furthermore, it will act as a sort of, in a way, like as a sign for its shareholders as well, for them to be actually implement corporate governance rules, right? I think, as well as the fourth one, which is definitely, directors' duties has always been, at the forefront of the Company Act. And I think in being able to not curb, for example, with EY's defense on the Wirecard situation, let's say that they said that, they just had a statement confirming the money in Philippines or in Singapore, and that's it. And that should be go beyond that than just having a statement, a confirmation. They should be investigating it, making sure that the bank does have it. And that's why a better proposal for like breaking down, the Big Four, it's a similar sort of antidote as the banks were, Barclays, Lloyds, Halifax, and HSBC, introducing challenger banks such as Metro Bank, Sterling Bank, if you know what I mean, Monzo Bank. And I think that's the better way of making sure that their power is limited. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting points in there. What do you think, Gia and Zach?
I think the one thing that kind of comes to my mind when you kind of talk about corporate governance reforms and all that stuff with the audit front is the case of Patisserie Valerie. I think that's the kind of a pertinent example that a lot of people know about. If you look at a case like that, you had 30 million overstated in its cash position. It's all 5 key members within the kind of Patisserie Valerie structure be arrested. So I think with that, it kind of shows you that somehow kind of a company as big as Patisserie Valerie, everyone sees on the high street, everyone's, I'm sure, familiar with it, how these kind of firms can still be acting in these fraudulent manners. So with that in mind, I think there's definitely a need for reform on that front, if a firm that size can be able to do that. And to kind of, by putting in those reforms, you can definitely mitigate the chance that it happens again.
Yeah, definitely. I think what's quite interesting is how it might relate to other industries. So, for example, with Amazon, it's everywhere. Nobody can really compete with it at the moment. And potentially, if we see benefits from, some of the Big Four having to, like smaller firms having being able to compete with the Big Four, if we see the benefits of that might have really big implications for big companies like Amazon.
Yeah, I think they're all really interesting ideas. And so just to kind of I guess kind of summarize the kind of key commercial takeaways here. The first one is the kind of increasing competition in the auditing kind of scene as the big four kind of lose their kind of place at the top of the pecking order. And a couple of others being the kind of, as Zach was saying, the kind of the decreased likelihood of these huge accounting scandals, such as Patisserie Valerie, such as Carillion, which the big four should have picked up on but didn't. And so I think these reforms are going to have a really big impacts on that in that sense as well. But also, I think just kind of a broader kind of increase in corporate governance is kind of driving all this, and kind of like properly managing companies and ensuring that creditors at the end of the day get their kind of have equal rights to the shareholders of the company. And so I think there's a number of really interesting issues there. Do you guys have any other thoughts on the issue?
None in particular. I think that's kind of been summarized quite well.
I think for me, it's just with the auditors, doing their actual job, and as well, like encouraging them to be moral arbiters instead of just like being able to them to be just like a company and just maximizing their profits. I think that will really help all the other industries, because all companies need auditors, and especially for the shareholders, it's that transparency that provides for them. Like, when you invest in, let's say, in Wirecard or in Carillion, they're not gonna collapse in like the next month or so. So I think that's why it's the transparency that gives. It's really vital as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting issue, and I think the kind of broader point that essentially companies like the big four, the big auditing firms, their job is to kind of catch these financial scandals and these kind of financial mismanagements of companies. And so the fact that they failed their job on numerous occasions, it's almost a justification in itself for significant reform. And so I find very, very kind of happy to see the kind of big four kind of be knocked off their peck. And I think it's going to give rise to a lot of interesting issues in the future. And also, I think a lot of law firms will also become subject to these kind of corporate governance duties, and they'll be giving advice to all of these auditing firms as a result of these new reforms. So I think there's loads of interesting stuff in there, loads of stuff to talk about in interviews and all that sort of thing. But yeah, I think that's about all we've got to say on that topic.
All right, so I'm going to talk about the Suez Canal. I think it's quite a pertinent issue, certainly in the media at the minute, and I think it's something that's great for commercial awareness in an interview scenario. So firstly, just going to kind of fill everyone in on the background information if people aren't up to speed. Suez Canal, it's a 193 canal that connects the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. So essentially allows you to get your trade from the Atlantic side through to like the Indian Ocean, Pacific, all of that. If you were to look at other alternative routes, you'd have to go down through the Cape of Good Hope to the bottom of Africa. By doing that, you'd add on a further 7,000 kilometers. So if you're thinking the delays in time, the increased fuel costs, it's a lot more viable to use the Suez Canal. In terms of the importance of it, 10% of global trade will go through the Suez Canal here. Very and each day, $9.5 billion will go through the Suez Canal. So it's a massive importance for global trade as a hub. In terms of the current situation that we're in, see, as you can see in the photo, we've got the Evergreen container that has been lodged there, and people are finding it hard to dislodge. Essentially, there are talks that it could take a couple of weeks more to dislodge it properly. So it's a massive issue that arises in a range of multitudes on this scale. Firstly, if you look at oil prices for all traders in particular, this is potentially a good couple of weeks. If you look at the basic principles of supply and demand, the less supply you have of something, the higher prices go. So with that in mind, we've seen benchmark oil prices rise 6% on Wednesday, which has been a great increase on that front. In terms of the actual how much oil trade goes through the canal, 4.4% of crude oil is transported through the canal per year. So it's a massive center on that front. In terms of the insurance issue, this was an area I kind of wanted to look at a lot because there's a lot of losses that are going to be incurred from a scenario like this. Firstly, if you look at the amount of like other containers that are being blocked, there's rumors that there are up to 200 other containers. So with insurance, you have a lot of different multitudes and areas you can insure, loss of revenues, injury losses, all of that. But I think with the Suez Canal, it hones in particularly on the loss of revenues. So there's going to be massive claims against insurers on that front. So a lot of your household names in insurance will be facing difficulties in the coming months with that in mind. And finally, I just wanted to kind of touch on political efforts from people to kind of alleviate the situation. Joe Biden in particular has offered his equipment and all of that to kind of help alleviate the situation. He kind of stated that they've got a lot better resources than other countries and they can help sort this quicker. So what they're looking to do is send some dredging experts over to kind of sort the situation. They're still waiting approval for this for this to happen, essentially. But it's a great sign of progress and that people are willing to kind of help and sort the situation out. But I think the key takeaway here is that for a player such as Joe Biden and the States to kind of be getting involved, it shows you the global impact that this issue is having. So with that in mind, I'd like to open the floor to anyone, kind of any thoughts from an economic, political, legal perspective. What do you guys think on the matter?
I think from a kind of economic perspective, something that's going to be quite interesting is this kind of exposed the fact that countries like the UK, the US, in fact all countries around the world are so interconnected and so reliant on trade from other countries. And this kind of this one ship blockage has caused enormous disruptions in the supply chains. And so it could mean that kind of shortages of certain goods in the UK and in other countries as well. And so I think that kind of it highlights a kind of a need for kind of a domestication of supply chains. And this has kind of already happened it's already been kind of emphasized with COVID-19, the fact that because international travel was kind of blocked, the kind of need to be able to grow your own food in your country, to be able to supply your own medicine, all that sort of thing, is kind of highlighted. And I think this just compounds all of that. And so I think it could kind of mark the end or kind of mark a shift towards domestic supply chains. And I think that's kind of got interesting implications for kind of business growth within the UK. And yeah, I think so.
It's definitely an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I'm not sure that I agree that it will cause people to focus on the domestic side of things a bit more. I actually think it will encourage like closer international bonds. Like the fact that Biden is getting involved with this shows that it is a global problem. But are we going to have global experts around the world there, all the time, or potentially people will focus more on the domestic side of things, or potentially we'll have like the logistics side of things, we'll have like a global outlook, like more people coming together.
I think for me, I agree with Gia regarding the situation. I think what the Suez Canal shows is just that how crazy it is that 10% of global trade is through this canal. I think indeed they need to either amplify the canal, if I'm being honest, or even look for another alternative. Because if you think that just the many containers, the many ships that come through this canal, if that happens again, it's going to be the same thing. So I think that's an issue that they should look at. And mostly as well in regards to this, I think it's a bad idea that for the supply chain to be domesticated, because in the first place, international trade, inter-reliance of economies, it prevents wars as well. And I think that's the sort of the idea of the funding of the European Union. Furthermore, as well as I think what's going to happen is that during these times, it leads for more solidarity for people, for example, the US as well, for other international countries to group together and bond as well. But moreover, during that time, if there's a lack of supply from imports, it will also benefit UK businesses right now, but hopefully it's a temporal sort of, outcome of this crisis. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point when you're talking about how it is so reliant on this. And obviously, if we're looking at the global matter, it needs a uniform effort to sort this. In terms of looking at the reliance of the Suez Canal, though, and the substitutability of it, these containers, a ship like the Evergreen one, it could carry up to 20,000 containers. So if you're looking at other avenues, yeah, you could look at building another canal, but you've got to look at other routes as well. Where would that be, and would that be viable to do that? If you're looking at areas like, say, aviation, it's not going to have the same scale. It's a very cost-effective way of doing it in terms of the transportation. But I think there's definitely a line of thinking that suggests, are we way too reliant on Suez Canal? And do we need to look at other areas where we can build other routes and all of that?
Yeah, I think as well as, looking at other routes, one of the reasons that obviously we use the Suez Canal is not necessarily the time, but the fuel and the cost of that. And I think that as we make things greener and there's a bigger focus on the environment, potentially we'll have ships that don't need fuel in the same way. They might be able to be powered in other ways. And so if people are happy to wait, another couple of weeks for their goods, which may be the way that things are going, and maybe not, then that could be another alternative. But other than that, I really can't see another way to shorten or find another way through, because that canal is at the narrowest point, and aside from offloading all of these containers and taking them on lorries on land or taking them over by plane, I don't really see another way of getting those ships through or the containers through with the same speed.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. But I mean, if we're thinking about kind of increasing the efficiency of that sort of travel, and we're kind of saying, I think we all agree that there isn't really a better way of transporting stuff from China, that sort of area, North Africa, through to Europe. And if there's no kind of better way of doing it than this, and there's clear inefficiencies within this kind of use of travel, I think that while perhaps it's not going to lead to an absolute revolution of domestication, I do think that there'll be kind of an increased onus on countries to kind of ensure that they have at least the bare minimum and can kind of supply their people with kind of the very much bare necessities. And so in that sense, it could lead to domestication. I think that's the only kind of way to solve this sort of reliance on the canal. But I think it'll be interesting to see which way it goes.
Yeah, one question I have for you, Zach, is that there's been lots of talk about unmanned ships. And before this incident, it was gaining quite a lot of traction. You'd need fewer staff on board, and it's just simpler. But since this has happened, do you think that will affect whether we have these unmanned ships? Do you think that this was more of like human error, or do you think we'll have more problems if this were to happen on an unmanned ship, and then like the legal implications of that would be far more complicated?
I think with the whole kind of unmanned ships and the move towards automation and all of that, I think, to be honest, it's not just the Suez Canal, it's the way the world's going. A lot of industries, a lot of digitalization of industries, it's a lot more efficient doing these things these ways. What I will say though is that with these things, sure, it can work very smoothly if you program these unmanned ships to kind of go down certain routes or whatever, and that works smoothly. In a situation like this, can these robots or machines react, and do they have these kind of contingency plans in place? That's the area where I think there needs to be a lot of discussion, because a scenario like this, it's clear that it can't be solved. So I think there needs to be a lot of discussion on that front. Do you need people within the area on the ship just to make sure that things are going smoothly, or do you need to program the machines better to react in these situations? I think it's an interesting area, and I think it's one that's going to certainly be a big discussion point for a lot of people. Yeah.
Yeah, I think particularly there's a really interesting kind of legal point around if ships become automated, same kind of automation anywhere, ships become automated and this sort of thing happens, kind of who pays? Because it's not necessarily the robot's fault, because it can't kind of compute out of a situation it hasn't kind of been programmed to respond to. And so kind of the liabilities that kind of come from that, I think is a really, really interesting point. And I think it's one that's going to be probably set in the next couple of years as kind of Tesla start releasing more and more automatic driving cars, etc. But yeah, just kind of as an aside, that's a really interesting point.
I think as well, as a final point for me as well. I think automation in general, I think it's usually it relies on machine learning. Hopefully it will rely further on that scope more. But if let's say that if something such as the Suez Canal happens, or something that they didn't really got programmed for would happen, I think that would be a big sort of slowdown on the sense of how efficient it will be. So probably like it will have to learn how to adapt in more situations, and it should be a different sort of training on how these unmanned ships or even cars would operate, not just like there's a road, follow it, etc. Thank you.
I think one last kind of question I'd like to open up to the floor. It might be a bit far-fetched view, but is there potential for a war on this front? Because it's such a reliant area where you can have like a lot of trade going through and a lot of reliance on it. And even if it's not a war, is there area for a lot of international conflict? Because you only have to look as far as, say, the Russia-Ukraine scandal with oil, and how quick Russia are to just cut off the supply there. Very quick actions that can have a massive knock-on effect. So do you guys think that there could be a similar issue arise on that front from this?
I think it's kind of notable. There's already been a war over the Suez Canal. So I think it was 1968, somewhere around there. Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, essentially bringing it under government control. So they were trying to essentially make profit from all the ships going through, trying to kind of tax it, all that sort of stuff. And the UK, France were having absolutely none of it, and they invaded Egypt, and that led to the kind of open treating the canal as kind of open. I think there's potential for that to repeat itself if kind of that sort of thing happened again. But I think in kind of this kind of scenario in isolation, I don't think it's necessarily going to start a war. But I think it's definitely potential in the coming years, as kind of people recognise the importance of the Suez Canal, that it could definitely be a target for that sort of thing.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that especially now, it's nobody's fault really at the moment. And also war is expensive. And following the pandemic, people don't have a lot of money. So yeah.
I think there's some really good points there. So yeah, just to kind of wrap up that, we kind of touched on the whole situation, oil prices rallying in reaction to it, the massive issue that insurance companies can face in claims, and then the international advice that can come through that. And then through opening up the floor, discuss a lot of different areas, including looking at international disputes, the over-reliance on a place like this, and other options for it. So that's kind of everything on the Suez Canal front.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, thank you everyone for joining us.